The message arrived at the worst possible moment. I was standing in my kitchen, sleeves rolled up, the smell of garlic and olive oil filling the air, when my phone buzzed against the counter. I glanced down, expecting a reminder or a neighbor asking about trash day. Instead, it was from my son. Family meeting. Tonight. 7:30. Private room, don't be late, that was it. No greeting, no concern, no explanation. I stared at the screen longer than I care to admit. At my age, you develop instincts you can't explain, an internal alarm that goes off when something isn't right. That message wasn't urgent. It was summons-like, as if I were being called in to answer for something, and I already knew what it would be about. My house, my businesses, my future, or rather, their version of my future. I set the phone down and turned off the stove. Suddenly, I wasn't hungry anymore. 2 months earlier, I'd collapsed at one of my businesses after working too long in the heat. Nothing dramatic, dehydration, exhaustion. A night in the hospital and a lecture from a doctor who looked young enough to be my grandson. But that was all it took. From that day on, the tone changed. Conversations stopped being conversations. They became strategies disguised as concern. Have you thought about slowing down? Maybe it's time to make things easier. Just planning ahead, Mom. Planning ahead for who? I typed back a short reply. I'll be there. Then I opened another message thread. One my son didn't know existed. Tonight, same plan, be ready. The reply came almost instantly. Always, I dressed carefully, not fancy, not fragile. Clothes that said I belonged in the room I was about to enter. Clothes with pockets, old habits die hard. The restaurant sat just off the highway, warm lights glowing through the windows, laughter spilling out every time the door opened. Families eating, couples celebrating. Normal life continuing, completely unaware that a quiet war was about to begin in the back room. I arrived early on purpose. The hostess led me down a hallway away from the noise. The carpet muted every step. At the end was a closed door with a small sign, reserved. The moment I walked in, I knew, no menus, no plates, no dinner, just a long table, a stack of papers, and 6 people already seated waiting. This wasn't a family meeting. It was an ambush, and they thought I'd walked in alone. But they were about to learn something important. If you've ever felt cornered by the very people who claim to love you, stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. The room smelled faintly of leather chairs and polished wood, money, in other words. The kind of place where decisions were made quietly and lives were rearranged without raised voices. They were already seated when I stepped in. My older son sat closest to the head of the table, posture stiff, fingers interlocked like he was preparing for negotiations, not dinner. His wife sat beside him, eyes sharp, smile thin and practiced. Across from them were her parents, neatly dressed, faces carefully neutral, as if they'd already chosen sides but didn't want to announce it out loud. At the far end sat my younger son. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That hurt more than I expected. And then there was the stranger. Mid-40s, expensive suit, laptop closed in front of him like a prop waiting for its cue. He stood halfway when I entered, extended a hand, and smiled with professional warmth. "Mrs. Carter," he said smoothly, "I help families make smooth transitions." Transitions? That was the word they always used when they meant control. I didn't take the chair right away. I let the silence stretch. Let everyone feel it. "I was told this was a family meeting," I said. My daughter-in-law exhaled a small laugh. "It is. We just brought help. You always say you like things done properly." The man slid a stack of documents toward the center of the table, perfectly aligned. No mess, no room for doubt. "These papers," he said, "are designed to simplify things. Given recent events, it's the responsible next step." Recent events. That was what they called one afternoon of dehydration. My son leaned forward. "This keeps everything out of court. No confusion later. You sign now, and we make sure everything stays in the family." I looked down at the papers but didn't touch them. "And if I don't?" I asked. The temperature in the room changed. Not dramatically, just enough. His voice dropped. "Then things get complicated." There it was, not concern, not love, a warning. My younger son shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should slow down," he muttered. "This feels fast." No one responded to him. I studied their faces, every one of them, counted their breaths, measured their confidence. Years ago, I learned that people who rush you are rarely acting in your best interest. So, I said calmly, you've already decided what's best for me. My older son's jaw tightened. Someone has to. I smiled then, not kindly, because in that moment everything became clear. They weren't protecting me. They were positioning themselves. I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around my phone, not to call anyone. Not yet, just to feel grounded. You're right about one thing, I said softly. Someone does have to make decisions. They leaned in, expecting surrender. What they didn't know was that this wasn't my first time walking into a room where everyone underestimated me, and it wouldn't end the way they thought. They believed the paperwork meant the battle was already won, but they had no idea what I'd been preparing behind the scenes. I didn't leave that room shaking. That surprised even me. On the drive home, the city lights blurred past my windshield while my mind stayed razor sharp. Something had shifted back there. Not just in them, in me. For weeks, I'd been questioning myself, wondering if I was being stubborn, if maybe slowing down really was the responsible thing. But responsibility doesn't come wrapped in threats, and love doesn't arrive with paperwork already filled out. I pulled into my driveway, sat in the dark car for a moment, and finally let myself breathe. My hands rested steady on the steering wheel. That's when I knew I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. Inside the house, I made tea I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table long after it went cold. I replayed every word from that meeting, not emotionally, strategically, who spoke first, who avoided eye contact, who stayed silent when it mattered. Silence can be louder than shouting. I stood and walked to the hallway cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were old documents I hadn't looked at in years, business records, contracts, handwritten notes from meetings long past. People assume age dulls awareness. What it really does is sharpen pattern recognition, and the pattern was obvious now. They weren't worried about my health. They were worried about timing. If I waited, they'd push harder. If I hesitated, they'd frame it as confusion. And if I resisted openly, they'd paint me as difficult, which meant I had only one option. I needed someone who understood systems the way I did. Someone who didn't panic. Someone who knew how to lock doors quietly before anyone realized they were closing. I reached for my phone. The name I tapped wasn't saved with a heart or a family label. It was saved with a single word: counsel. We'd met years earlier over a small dispute, nothing dramatic. But I remembered two things clearly. She listened without interrupting, and she didn't waste time comforting people who needed clarity instead. She answered on the second ring. I was wondering when you'd call, she said calmly. That stopped me cold. You knew? I asked. I suspected, she replied. When someone asks about capacity instead of consent, it's usually not about care. I closed my eyes. I told her everything. The meeting, the documents, the pressure. The way my own child spoke to me like I was a liability instead of a mother. She didn't gasp. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said one sentence that changed everything. They're trying to move fast because they think you're alone. I smiled for the first time that night. I'm not, I said. Not anymore. Good, she replied. Then here's what we're going to do. She outlined the steps, not emotionally, not dramatically, but methodically. Update, protect, document, prepare. By the time we hung up, the fear I'd been carrying for weeks had dissolved into something else entirely. Focus. They thought the meeting was the opening move. In reality, it was their tell. And they had no idea how far ahead I already was. What they didn't know was that while they were drafting documents, I was building a defense, and the next meeting would not end quietly. Preparation doesn't feel dramatic when you're doing it right. It feels quiet, methodical, almost boring. That's how the next 2 weeks passed. No shouting matches, no confrontations, no dramatic phone calls. Just steady, deliberate work. The kind most people never notice until it's too late. The first thing I did was stop talking. Not completely, but selectively. I answered calls. I returned texts. I smiled when necessary. I let them believe I was thinking, considering, weighing their concerns. Meanwhile, I was writing everything down. Dates, times, who said what, which phrases were repeated, which suggestions kept resurfacing. Patterns don't matter until you prove they're patterns, and proof lives in details. Then came the paperwork. I sat with my counsel in her small office. the air smelling faintly of coffee and old books, and we rebuilt my world on paper. My will, my business structures, my contingency plans, every asset accounted for, every authority defined, no ambiguity, no loopholes. She explained each document slowly, not because I couldn't understand, but because clarity is protection. You're not taking anything away, she reminded me. You're deciding who gets access and when. That distinction mattered more than I realized. Next came something that made my stomach twist: documentation of behavior. Not assumptions, she said, evidence. So when my son called again, casual, friendly, checking in, I listened more than I spoke. When he suggested another meeting, I asked questions instead of arguing. When he mentioned doctors, evaluations, and making things official, I noted the language. And when he crossed the line, just slightly, just enough, I saved it. I didn't provoke. I didn't accuse. I let him reveal himself. One afternoon, a voicemail came in while I was at the grocery store. His tone was different, frustrated, pressed. "Mom, this can't wait forever," he said. "If you keep dragging your feet, people are going to start asking why. And once that happens, it's out of our hands." Out of our hands, that was the phrase. I stood in the frozen food aisle, phone pressed to my ear, heart pounding, not from fear, but from recognition. That voicemail changed everything. By the time I got home, my counsel already had a secure folder labeled and waiting. The file went in with a dozen others, emails, messages, notes, all forming a single, undeniable picture. Not a worried son, a pressured outcome, a controlled narrative. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Because for the first time, I wasn't wondering if something was wrong. I knew, and more importantly, I could prove it. They thought silence meant compliance. They thought patience meant weakness. What they didn't realize was that every word they spoke was tightening the net they'd never see coming. The next time we sat across from each other, it wouldn't be in a restaurant, and the rules would no longer be theirs. The next meeting didn't happen because I agreed to it. It happened because I allowed it. That distinction mattered more than they realized. I chose the location, a neutral office space, bright and professional, no private dining rooms or dramatic entrances. I told them I wanted clarity. That word worked like a magnet. People who want control love clarity as long as they believe they're the ones defining it. They arrived confident. My older son looked relieved, almost smug. His wife carried a folder thicker than the one she'd brought before. Her parents sat close together, whispering quietly. My younger son arrived last, hesitating in the doorway like someone stepping into a storm he hadn't created. They expected discussion. They didn't expect structure. I let them speak first. I listened while they repeated the same points: health, responsibility, efficiency. I watched them talk around me instead of to me, as if the decision had already been made and my role was simply to agree. Then I slid a single document across the table. "Before we go any further," I said calmly, "I want this acknowledged." My son frowned. "What's this?" "Boundaries," I replied. "In writing." His smile flickered. The document outlined something very simple. I alone retained decision-making authority. All financial and medical discussions would go through my appointed representative. Any attempt to act on my behalf without written consent would be considered interference. "This is unnecessary," his wife said quickly. "We're family." "Exactly," I said, "which is why it should be clear." The room shifted. They pushed back softly at first, concerns, questions, warnings disguised as advice. Then my son made his mistake. "You're being influenced," he said sharply. "Someone's gotten to you. You wouldn't be doing this otherwise." The words hung there, heavy and dangerous. I leaned back slightly. "That's an interesting claim," he shrugged. "People don't just change like this." I nodded and reached into my bag. "I agree," I said. "They don't." I placed my phone on the table and pressed play. His voice filled the room. Calm, confident, recorded weeks earlier. "If she keeps delaying, people will start questioning her capacity. And once that happens, we won't need her permission." Silence slammed into the room. His wife's face drained of color. Her parents looked at her, then at him. "That's out of context," he snapped. I pressed play again. This time, another recording. Another sentence. Another moment he'd assumed would never surface. My younger son stood abruptly. "You said that?" he asked, voice shaking. "You told me this was about helping her." No one answered him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply said, "This is why we're done having private conversations." The confidence drained from the room like air from a punctured tire. They'd walked in expecting leverage. They walked out realizing they'd left fingerprints everywhere. They thought exposure would scare me into compliance, but what it actually did was force their next move. I knew the silence wouldn't last. It never does when someone loses control they were certain they deserved. 3 days after that meeting, the first crack appeared, not from my son directly, but from the world around me. A polite call from my bank asking me to verify recent inquiries. A voicemail from a medical office confirming an appointment I hadn't scheduled. A neighbor stopping me mid-conversation to ask, carefully, if I was feeling okay lately. The whispers had started. They were subtle, strategic, impossible to confront head-on, and that's what made them dangerous. People weren't accusing me of anything. They were wondering. And wondering, when repeated often enough, starts to sound like truth. I sat at my kitchen table that night, lights low, notebook open, documenting everything. Each call, each comment, each question phrased as concern. I didn't rage, I didn't panic, I categorized. That's when I realized this wasn't about convincing me anymore. They were working on everyone else. If they couldn't get my signature, they'd get my reputation. If they couldn't control my assets directly, they'd try to make me look unstable enough that someone else would step in for my own good. It was almost impressive, if it hadn't been so cruel. My younger son came over that weekend, quieter than usual. He sat across from me, hands folded, eyes tired. He came to see me, he said. Late, he was angry. I waited. He wanted me to sign something, he continued. A statement about you, about memory issues. He said it was just for the record. My chest tightened. And I didn't, he said quickly. I couldn't, none of it was true. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. He held on longer than necessary. He said if I didn't help, I was choosing sides, my son added. That I'd regret it. I nodded slowly. That was the moment it stopped being a family disagreement. It became harassment. The next morning, my counsel and I spoke for over an hour. Not emotionally, procedurally. She explained the next steps the way someone explains emergency exits before a flight. Calm, clear, non-negotiable, protective boundaries, formal notices, documentation submitted to neutral parties. If he escalates again, she said, we don't respond privately, we respond officially. That afternoon, I signed a letter I never imagined I'd need, one that formally restricted anyone from acting, speaking, or arranging services on my behalf without written consent. It felt heavy, necessary. When the letter was sent, the phone went quiet again. But this silence was different, sharper, because now I knew exactly what came next. People who lose quietly don't retaliate, but people who feel exposed. They make one last move. And when that final move came, it wasn't a phone call. It was a court notice with my name on it. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning. Certified mail, official seal, my name typed neatly across the front like it belonged there. I didn't open it right away. I made coffee first, sat down, took a breath. Because somewhere deep down, I already knew what it would say. Inside was a formal notice requesting mediation, filed by my son. The language was careful, almost gentle. It spoke of concern, of responsibility, of a desire to ensure proper oversight given my age and recent behavior. Recent behavior, refusing to hand over my life. I read it twice, then set it on the table and called my counsel. Good, she said after a pause. This means he stopped trying to control the narrative quietly. The mediation was scheduled 2 weeks later in a government building downtown. Neutral territory, neutral mediator. No private rooms, no theatrics. Just record. The day of the meeting, I wore a simple suit and flat shoes, not to look strong, but to feel steady. My younger son came with me, not as backup, but as witness. He didn't speak much, but his presence mattered. My older son arrived with an attorney of his own. Younger, nervous, the kind of man who still believed this could be spun. The mediator explained the rules. One person speaks at a time, evidence is presented. Interruptions are discouraged. Then my son spoke. He talked about stress, about risk, about how hard it was watching a parent decline. He never looked directly at me while he said it. When it was my turn, I didn't argue, I presented. My counsel submitted the timeline, calls made in my name, appointments scheduled without my consent, financial inquiries I hadn't authorized. Then came the recordings. Clear, undeniable, spoken in his voice. The room changed when those played. Concern turned into calculation, protection into pressure. The mediator asked him directly, "Did you attempt to arrange medical evaluations without your mother's permission?" He hesitated. "Just long enough." "Yes," he said, "but only because she needed help." "And did you attempt to gain access to her assets without legal authority?" she asked. Silence. His attorney leaned in, whispered urgently. My younger son spoke then, quietly but firmly. He described being asked to sign a statement he knew was false, how he refused, how the pressure didn't stop. That was the moment the mediator closed her notebook. "This is no longer a misunderstanding," she said calmly. "This is interference." The outcome was swift. Formal boundaries were issued. My son was barred from representing himself as my agent in any capacity. Any further attempts would carry consequences far more serious than embarrassment. As we stood to leave, my older son looked at me, not angry this time. Stunned, like someone realizing too late that the game ended while he was still bluffing. I thought that would be the end, but power doesn't disappear quietly, and the final reckoning was still waiting. Life didn't snap back to normal after the mediation. It settled into something quieter. My phone stopped buzzing. No surprise appointments. No just checking in calls wrapped in concern. The silence felt strange at first, like stepping into a house after a storm and realizing the walls were still standing. I kept expecting anger, retaliation, one last attempt to regain control. It never came. Instead, what followed was distance. My older son stopped calling entirely. Holidays passed without invitations. Photos of birthdays and celebrations appeared online, events I wasn't part of. At first, that hurt more than anything else in this whole ordeal. Then it didn't. Because peace, I learned, doesn't always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with clarity. My younger son stayed close. Not hovering, not protective. Just present. He helped me reorganize the office one afternoon, quietly throwing out old files I no longer needed. At one point, he stopped and said, "You know, you didn't do anything wrong." I nodded, even though part of me still needed to hear it. The businesses kept running. The house stayed mine. My life remained intact, not because I fought loudly, but because I prepared carefully. Because I didn't confuse love with surrender. There's a strange grief in realizing that someone you raised sees you as an obstacle instead of a person. I carried that for a while, still do sometimes, but I also carried something else. Pride, not the sharp, defensive kind. The quiet kind that comes from standing up without becoming bitter, from protecting yourself without destroying everyone around you. I didn't take revenge. I took responsibility. I updated my plans. I clarified my wishes. I made sure my voice, my actual voice, was documented, undeniable, and respected. And I learned something I wish I'd understood sooner. Age does not erase authority. Kindness does not equal weakness. And love that demands control is not love at all. If you're listening to this and feeling uneasy, if someone in your life keeps rushing you, speaking for you, deciding about you instead of with you, pay attention to that feeling. It's not paranoia. It's awareness. You don't need to shout. You don't need to accuse. You just need to prepare. Because the moment you stop assuming good intentions is often the moment you finally protect yourself. And that, I've learned, is not selfish. It's survival.